Good morning. We are so excited to have you here today as we kick off our fall education hour. We're going to be doing something a little bit different than what we're used to. A part of what we will be presenting is an opportunity to interview different parishioners and staff at St. Paul's, so you get to hear a little bit more of our story, which will help us figure out our story as a parish as a whole. And today, it's homecoming. There's a lot of the start of the church year, there's a lot of new activity starting again at the church. And so today we figured there wouldn't be a better way to kick it off than to interview our interim rector, the Reverend Canon Albert Ogle. Thanks for joining us
today.
Thanks,
Dan. Good.
Yeah. When did you first consider the idea of becoming a priest?
Oh, that's a really good question. Maybe when I was about 11, and other people saw something in me, and I wasn't going to church. My family, I called them happy pagans. I was baptized as a member of the Church of Ireland, so I was an Episcopalian, but I didn't practice and so on. But it was very interesting that other people saw something in me as a young man. And for me, I started going to church. I started getting involved with the Christian community in around 13, 14. I started going to church, and I was, my parents were going through a divorce. My country was going into civil war, so the church became a kind of family for me. And it was like people believed, or they saw something in that I started paying attention to. And for me, there were two kind of major stumbling blocks to getting my head around being a priest. One is I had a stammer as a young man, and Joe Biden talks about it being a club, but the idea of standing up in front of people or reading a service or preaching a sermon was like anathema. I couldn't see myself being able to do that. So there was a kind of technical part of that I had to kind of get my head around. And then around 16, 17, I became aware that I was probably gay. And so there was a moral dimension as well, that the Church of Ireland was very conservative, the Church of England was very conservative, so the possibilities, imagining that you could function as a priest who's gay in the 70s was kind of inconceivable. And so it's very interesting that God does the calling, and we know from our Jewish brothers and sisters that God calls unlikely people and broken people to ministry and to be agents of spirit. And so it was something that I grew into, and other people in different stages of ministry were able to help me to live into that.
Wow. And so you started as, a young man, and now you're here, all these years.
An old man.
No, well, you're not retired yet, so you're still here. But how has the priesthood changed for you over the years, and how's it remained the same? You have kind of this lifetime of being in this role.
Yeah, I mean, it's over 40 years now, and so it's interesting because I think God finds us where we are. I think there was a kind of maybe a naivety or a kind of simplicity about what I thought being a priest was. And in the early years in Ireland, it was about reconciliation. We were bringing together Protestants and Catholics who didn't get along. So the church was both part of the problem and part of the solution. And so I think priesthood, like all religions, our job is to mark time for people. Whether it's birth, initiation, confirmation, is rites of passage, deep commitment in marriage, and other ways we also mark the end of a life, a celebration. So religious leaders have that in common. I think that has remained the same. I think what has been a constant for me is the way in which the relationship, priesthood is something that is shared with community. There were times in my ministry, I lost 3 jobs in the church for being an out gay man. So there were times I just wanted to give it up. And then some people would say to me, Albert, would you baptize my child? Or they'd come for counseling, or they'd want me to do their marriage or their funeral. So there's a way in which the community also held priesthood when I didn't want it. And so that's been a constant, that there've always been people, if you're serving in a church, in a community, there are always people who have your back and who in a mysterious way also share in that priesthood.
Yeah. It sounds like part of that community reinforcing and holding you up. There obviously were challenges. What were some of your key challenges over the years with your calling?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the main one was the issue of being gay. And it was clear that even today in the Church of Ireland and the Church of England, there's still kind of ambivalence and a sort of anti-gay position. We recently had a vote in Ireland on gay marriage, and the churches came out against it, including the Episcopal community there. So, and I'd come to the United States. I visited a friend of mine from college who married a woman priest here. And the American church was always a bit of a rebel, that we ordained the first women here in Philadelphia, and the church here seemed to be more open to whether it's attitude to divorced people or to gay and lesbian people. So it became clear to me that if I was going to continue in some form of ministry, that it would be in the United States. So I moved here in 1982. And so, but even, there was lots of work to be done within the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church has not always been as open and welcoming as it is today, and we had a whole struggle, just like the country had a whole struggle around marriage for gay and lesbian people. And so it was really very interesting to be a part of that and to show that that God is doing the calling, and that it's much easier now for younger people, both in schools, to come out and be accepted. I think for a lot of young people, this is no longer the issue it was for when I was in my teens and 20s. So I feel that probably, in terms of mission, that has been a way that theme of reconciliation, of reconciling people who were marginalized and on the fringes of society and the church, that we have been more welcoming and more open to the gifts that people bring. Yeah. And speaking of gifts, there's a lot of different roles in the church. And in our tradition, you're ordained a deacon and then you were ordained a priest, and those are both seen as gifts. How do you compare those two roles, the role of the deacon and the role of the priest? Well, that was a really good question. I mean, it was very interesting when you were ordained a deacon. So St. Paul's got to see that process. You were ordained a deacon and then you were ordained a priest here. And I think the wisdom of the church is that you have two different roles. The deacon in the New Testament they were the waiters and the waitresses who served the poor so that the apostles could go out and evangelize. And so the idea of serving people became very much a core value in the diaconate. So you're ordained first a servant, a slave, and the collar is you're a slave to God and to the community. And then as a priest, you're kind of like a manager, you're a leader. So and you remain a deacon. It's not that you're promoted to a priest. You don't stop being a deacon. So you have to weigh out in your ministry that servant leadership that becomes important. There are times you have to be ahead of the community, and you have to be prophetic, and you have to say things that are difficult to say. And in a way, in the Episcopal Church, we expect that from our rectors. We give them tenure because they're supposed to be controversial. They're supposed to stir up. They're supposed to be ahead of us, saying this is what the church is called to be. And I've seen that I had a great mentor in Laguna Beach, which is the first congregation that welcomed me in the United States. But Bob Cornelison would talk about the rector, the local rector, if that rector is doing their work, is more important than the mayor, because they're not looking over their shoulder for votes. They can, and for Laguna and a lot of this country, it was a stance on the Vietnam War. And many of the Protestant clergy were fired because of their position on Vietnam. And Bob was the only one that survived because he had tenure. Yeah. And we know now much more about the lies and the duplicity and the incredible damage that that war did to not only to the world but to this country. And so how do you both step out and take a prophetic stand? We had to do that. The Episcopal Church was amazing in the crisis around AIDS and HIV, and that idea of being welcoming to people. And so that was a very formative time in my ministry, to be able to work again as a bridge between the medical community and those impacted by this horrible disease.
Yeah, I know you did a lot of work with AIDS here in the United States, but there was also a global dimension to that work. And could you tell us more about, as you've traveled around the world, where are the places the church has been prophetic, and where is it, being a stumbling block to people? Because I'm sure you've seen both.
Well, there's an interesting connection with St. Paul's around some of that global AIDS work, because I did most of my work in this country was in California. And so I did basically, 7 years hard looking at local services in how would you set up a model AIDS center. We set one up in Pasadena, and we developed this statewide AIDS plan. So after doing that, I was pretty burnt out. But a friend of mine connected me with the Archbishop of Uganda, a guy called Yona Okoth, and I brought him here to St. Paul's. And St. Paul's was incredibly welcoming, and there was a physician at Jefferson called Ed McGee, who was a member here. And so there was a great, wonderful openness about St. Paul's to get involved and to help this man who was dealing with this huge crisis in his country. 1 in 3 Ugandans were infected with AIDS. There were millions of orphans that many of the bishops were taking care of themselves. So it was very interesting seeing the Church of Uganda in the early years, which was a very evangelical, conservative church, but it wasn't homophobic. It was interesting. There was a political agenda that happened around Bush II. When Bush II was elected, the evangelical community supported him. So there was a kind of culture war that because the evangelicals had failed here on the gay issue, they exported that to Africa. And so it was very interesting seeing how the kind of pre-Bush Anglican church in Africa was very prophetic and had martyrs. Their archbishop was martyred. Yona escaped with his life. Idi Amin was going to kill him. And so you had these very courageous leaders. And then I saw that shift into a very kind of sexist, homophobic, very conservative agenda that was led by the church in the United States. And just that battle, the Episcopal Church, we had a kind of divorce within our own community. That was exported to places like Uganda and Africa and South America. So what I've seen in my global work is that the church is, again, both part of the problem that there's something like 38 countries in Africa where it's still illegal to be LGBT, and the church is in the front row. The Episcopal Anglican Church is in the front row of that persecution.
Yeah, so could you talk a little bit more about some of the differences between the Church of England or Ireland and the American Episcopal Church? I know you've talked about it, but that seems really important as we're thinking about how the church impacts people not just locally, but globally in some of these, positive and negative ways.
So the Church of England, basically wherever the British colonized, they took their church and they exported that. And so what we have today is something like 70 countries where you have national churches that are very alive, particularly in the global south. And in Uganda, you have a very vibrant church community. And in the AIDS crisis, the church network was more trusted than the government. So you have a very powerful network. So the English Anglican Church started that, but it also took with it some of its issues around racism and class and homophobia and sexism. And the fact that you have 38 countries in Africa, and it was the old British colonial laws that were revitalized and used against gay and lesbian people. The difference, I mean, I grew up in that world. I was ordained in the Church of Ireland, which was the state church until 1870. So you had a minority of Protestants, and people had to tithe. They were taxed if they were Presbyterians or Roman Catholics. So you had a very elite, privileged community. And in England, the Church of England is still the state church. And that comes out of the history of the Reformation and so on. And what I loved about coming to the United States was that a lot of the kind of the power and the energy that kind of evangelism that a church usually has, that is squelched if the church is seen as the ministry of God, right? It's like the ministry of health, and it's run by the government. And so there's a lot the church gives up when it becomes a state church. And Anglicans, we are, in our DNA, we have that love of state church, even though there's only 3 million Episcopalians. But sometimes, I mean, you have a president die, and who does the funeral? It's the Episcopalians. And so up until the middle of the last century, you had very powerful political leaders who were Episcopalians. So St. Paul's, part of our DNA is that kind of establishment, leadership, elite, and so on. And so how do we heal that? Or how do we transform that so that it's about service to the community rather than maintaining privilege or control? We love the English Anglican sound in this church. Our music is steeped in the music of Stamford and Parry and part of that high Anglican establishment. But there was a part of that was also really harmful and damaging, where people were colonized. As an Irishman, I was colonized. I have the soul of a colonized person, even though I'm white. Sure. And so the church blessed that. The Church of England blessed that wherever it went. And so how do we differentiate between that revolutionary spirit of democracy and liberty that shaped, and many of the framers of the American Constitution were from the Episcopal tradition. So we have a parallel in some ways if you look at how our governance is set up, that we don't trust absolute power. The power of the bishop in England is different from the authority and the power of the bishop in the United States. We weren't sure at one time if we actually wanted to have bishops because we didn't trust them, because they were appointed by the crown. And so what I love about the Episcopal Church is this balance between the power, say, of the rector, the power of the vestry, that it's about a balance of power to achieve a common good.
Yeah, and you talked about some of the things you've seen at St. Paul's, the hospitality over the years that kind of drew you back, and the music. What are some of the, you've been serving here a year now, what would you consider are some of the key gifts and charisms in this parish after having been here for a year?
I found, it's interesting, that first experience with Archbishop Ogle, when my husband got a job at Jefferson, so I moved here to follow him. I didn't come here to work at St. Paul, so I came because Mile got a job at Jefferson. And we just found a place down the road. So my neighbor said, St. Paul's is looking for a new rector. And I said, no, thank you. Been there, done that. But the interim position would be something that I'd like to explore. And initially, it looked like that wasn't going to happen. And then it happened. It happened. So I saw that as a calling. And I knew St. Paul's from that relationship with Archbishop Ogle. And I knew that it was a great place, and I knew a little bit about the history here, about that it's always had a heart for serving the city. And what I've been amazed at, a number of people like, Pat Voigt is serving some of the poorest children in our city through the Catholic School Network. And Fred Voigt, who just passed away, was one of the most trusted leaders in terms of reconciliation for the city. and did enormous good to bring the political community together. And Stuart Graham, who served until recently before he retired, he served in political office. So this church up here on Chestnut Hill has this vision, which is much larger even than the village of Chestnut Hill. This church is very much committed to the city and to the transformation of poverty. And we've got people like Tom O'Rourke who serve on the Face-to-Face board. It's an extraordinary program. And so this ongoing outreach and commitment through Rummage and through people giving generously, the shop and drop that we're doing, there is this enormous heart for people on the margins. And what is it we can learn from that in terms of our mission of what God is calling us to do next?
Yeah, so you see the outreach as this gift and this charism for the future as well as present. On the flip side of that last question, what are some of the challenges for St. Paul's as we embark on a new chapter in our 160-year-old history?
Yeah, again, we're healing from our privilege. We're seeing the damage of white privilege throughout our country that's dividing the country, and our diocese is leading. There's a commission on anti-racism. And so the challenge for those of us who have been privileged and white is what is it we can do in our day to heal and transform that racism? And I saw, a couple of weeks ago, I met this amazing lawyer, and he's a friend of some friends in the community here, and he started a charter school in Baltimore for young black and brown boys. And I said, well, why not girls as well? But he said, there are challenges, there are particular challenges, educational and social challenges for young men. And so they've set up a kind of English, kind of almost choir school model in Baltimore that they have this waiting list, so they are educating these young men for the future. And it's school uniforms and school ties and very, and almost religious in terms of its values and its culture. And they wanted to know is, could they come and be a school here at St. Paul's? And I thought about that, and I thought about, we talk about reparations, and what does that mean? That I need to write checks to, guilt money? Reparations for me is that kind of transformation where an institution like St. Paul's that has been privileged and white and rich could partner with one of these emerging service. I mean, the idea of having a school here that might have a music that would serve communities of color and have leadership in partnership together. What a mission that would be in terms of this campus and these buildings that would live again, and a way that we use our resources and our network and our gifts to bring about that kind of transformation.
Yeah, you just mentioned the word mission. What does that word mean to you, the word mission? And how is St. Paul's discerning our mission in this interim period?
Mission is a really good word, and I think about my own journey with what ministry means with different communities, and I've served in many different churches, I've served in the nonprofit world, but it's all about, the common theme is the transformation of God's world that is broken and seems despairing, and how do you bring the light, how do you bring the love of God and bring about, we think that priesthood is about just the transformation of the bread and wine, but that's just the beginning. That's the engine oil that we then go out and transform the world. So mission has meant different things at different times, but it's also about a kind of passion and the love of God that infuses the world so that people are given hope, people are given jobs, people are given health care. And what I love about St. Paul's is that the gospel is incarnate here. And in discovering what has, there was a rector here who hasn't been given a lot of attention a while back, but I just heard about this from Cliff Cutler. And if you read the history of the parish, and he was the chair of the Commission on Racism in Philadelphia. And so he and the people of St. Paul's, they were concerned about racism in the 30s and the 40s. and about how do we transform that. So this isn't new, but it may be that we bring new skills, new technologies, new resources to this problem that we have today. But the common goal is the transformation and repair of God's world.
Yeah, repairing the breach. And so that seems like as we're kind of setting the stage for the next rector to be able to enter into some of the threads that we've been discerning as a community over this year. What advice would you give to this incoming new person? And what advice would you give to the vestry and congregation as they begin to work with the new priest?
Well, what's very exciting right now, Dan, is that the vestry is working on what are our core values here at St. Paul's? What are the things that we want to get up for in the morning that people are passionate about? Because if people are in touch with their gifts and their passion, then they're not going to burn out. They're not going to. It's not going to be a burden. So that is a very interesting process that our vestry is going through right now. And then all of the ministries. How do we build a center? Carol Shepherd talked about the shaft. How do we find that shaft, that pivot, that then helps all of those expressions of the common values of St. Paul's? And that's taking a little time for us, but I think if we do that hard work, it's going to be easy then, if this congregation understands what its mission is, there's going to be somebody out there who's going to also be set on fire by that. And that's a part of the discernment, that somewhere out there, God has already prepared someone who's going to be on fire with the vision that's already emerging here. And the danger, some people saying, well, we should just wait for the next rector to figure out all this and do this, and we shouldn't be changing that much here. And I disagree with that, because the danger is that if you wait for a kind of Messiah to come in and tell us what our mission is, it's not going to sustain. It's not going to sustain, because it's something that will be imposed. And the Episcopal Church is very suspicious of charismatic leadership. We're much more about an institution that is 160 years old. We're on a journey with God, and we are the presence of Jesus in the world. And it's bigger than one person. We're all going to pass through here. But the values of this place and the ministries of this place continue to manifest in new and exciting ways. And that's why the work of discerning the mission right now is so vital. And we have to figure that out before the rector is called.
Yeah. And as we're discerning this mission, who could have predicted this global health crisis we're going through? And I'm thinking about what you said earlier about how you were involved in a health crisis here in the United States and also globally through your work in Uganda with the AIDS crisis. I'm sure there's a lot that you carry over into what we're doing in the here and now. Any insights into what COVID-19 is doing to change the way we think of church and doing ministry?
It's really good. What COVID is showing us more than anything is we are connected to one another in a way that maybe we don't want to be connected, and it crosses boundaries of nationality and class and race and so on. So we have to get our hands around this thing and do it together. So I think, and the other thing is back to that idea of mission, in getting out of our buildings, and we were kind of exiled from church as we knew it, but it freed us to be the presence of Christ in the world and to kind of evangelize and heal and support one another in a different way. And that's changed us. And so people talk about, when we get back to normal. I don't think there's going to be going back to normal. I think the way in which we're communicating virtually, the way in which we are seeing our connection outside of the building is going to continue to grow our sense of who we are as church, as the people of God. And I think that's exciting. And I think that certainly the younger generation, one of the things that touched me about the confirmation class that we're doing together, when one of our members said, I'm not sure the world is going to be there when I'm your age. And I've never thought of that. Again, I'm privileged. I've always thought the world was going to be there. And for these young people and the issues they face around climate change, around other pandemics that will come, what I see great young leadership, you, Marissa, Andy, and others in our congregation, who are continuing to take the traditions of this place and the values of this place and to be able to translate it to those young people who feel a kind of despair, a hopelessness. And how does the gospel translate into that? What is the word that we need to preach and live in that? So I'm encouraged by you and by the work that we're doing here at St. Paul's.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to get some younger people, maybe even in the conversation room as we continue this series and learn from them as well. You just talked a lot about the future of kind of the world and of the parish. What about you? What's your future? What are you going to do after St. Paul's? If you can even think that far ahead.
It's interesting because I've been a priest for so long that it's very hard. I mean, there's a sense in which I see there needs to be, and I see this as a good thing. Sometimes we need to get out of the way. Sometimes we need to get off that committee because we need new blood and new insight that we don't see. We are blind spots. So part of it is, I'm seeing there are things that I used to be able to do in my 20s and 30s and 40s that either I don't have the energy or I don't want to do anymore. And so part of it is I need to get out of the way. And there are other things that I'd like to do. I'd like to be able to travel more. Obviously, you can't do that when you're working in a parish. I'd like to be able to do a lot more writing. I've got a couple of books in me that I want to do. And I also paint. So I want to do more painting. And I want to enjoy living in this wonderful community. So, and the burden, it's interesting. People look at a priest, you think, well, Sunday's the only day you work, or it's all about preaching a good sermon. But it is both a very magnificent job because you have so many skills that you are invited to use and engage. You get to see the incredible privilege of seeing people sharing their deepest, intimate struggles. That is a great privilege that we share. But it's also, it's a very demanding job. And so I'm looking forward to not kind of doing that. I'm excited that this is kind of like my last gig here to be able to help and journey with St. Paul's. But I'm looking forward to, when the parish calls a rector, that I can step back and say, okay, I've done my bit. And now there's some other things that God wants me to do.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us today. We're going to be continuing this series throughout the rest of the fall, and we'll be alternating certain weeks with the Adult Education Forum as well. That's going to be online, and thank you for joining us. We're going to meet afterwards for a little bit of discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
How'd that go?